Today, of course, I'd like to talk about the Kennedy assassination. Other than the mega crimes of Stalin and Hitler and Mao, it probably was the worst and most heinous murder of the 20th century. This young, incredible, successful president taken from us. Tomorrow in the history video, I'll talk about the Kennedy administration, his legacy, his record, and the process that he was undergoing himself and set in motion nationally and internationally at the time that he was murdered. But today I'd like to talk about the assassination itself. Soon after the assassination, within 24 hours, Lee Harvey Oswald was arrested, and there was really a rush to judgment that he was the only killer and that he acted alone. And it was put out that the reason he killed Kennedy was that he was a frustrated communist, quasi-communist who had gone to Mexico City and tried to make it with the Castro regime, had been to Russia, and all kinds of stuff like that. And the Warren Commission, that was headed by Chief Justice Earl Warren, ratified that conclusion for all kinds of different reasons, which are unclear. But the conclusion was totally debunked in the late 1970s when the House Committee on Assassinations reviewed the evidence that was available. And it included modern scientific techniques that analyzed the filming of the assassination by one of the bystanders. And the filming, an early version of what we now do with cell phones all the time, included audio. And using their techniques, the commission investigated the audio and said it conclusively proved that there was more than one shooter. And most likely the shooter was not in the school building that overlooked the plaza, but from a so-called grassy knoll in the distance in which a shooter could be concealed. They didn't take it further, but the questions lingered as to who did it. Then research that's been done in the last decade or so has tended to confirm that there was a mob involvement led by Carlos Marcello, who was the mob boss for Louisiana and for that region of Texas. And he had extensive ties to Jack Ruby, who killed Oswald, and to Oswald himself through an intermediary. And the evidence suggests that someone, perhaps the CIA, induced Oswald to go to Russia and to go to Mexico, in effect to firm up his communist credentials so that he could be framed for the assassination and the country could go down the path of thinking it was a communist attack. The KGB files, which have been released, show that Khrushchev was devastated by the assassination and considered it a huge blow to the Soviet Union. And increasingly, the evidence suggests that Castro felt likewise. Robert Caro, in his famous biography of Johnson, in his most recent volume, says that Kennedy was secretly meeting through an emissary with Castro's representative to discuss normalization of relations between the country. And that stopped on a dime when Kennedy was killed. And Caro writes that Castro was inconsolable after Kennedy's death because that broke apart a real opportunity for a relationship. So increasingly the evidence suggested that somehow the CIA was involved, somehow the FBI was involved, and certainly the mob was involved. The motivation for the mob's involvement was clear. They spent a lot of money helping Kennedy get elected in 1960, in particular bribing elections officials and sheriffs in West Virginia to get them to throw the election, the primary against Humphrey, to Kennedy. And then in Chicago, working on voting dead people so that Illinois would go for Kennedy over Nixon, which it did by a very small margin. And then when Kennedy was president, Bobby, the Attorney General, turned on the mob and was vigorous, some say vicious, in the prosecution of them. And in particular got Carlos Marcello deported. And there's a whole odyssey of his trip to Guatemala and stuff, but he conceived a fierce hatred of the Kennedys. The CIA didn't like Kennedy because right after the Bay of Pigs, he fired Allen Dulles, who was in charge of the CIA, and got rid of much of the senior leadership of the agency. The Cuban exiles, who worked closely with the CIA, they had been together in the Bay of Pigs invasion, also didn't like Kennedy because he canceled the air support at the Bay of Pigs and left the troops there on the beach to be killed and captured by Castro. So there was, and the FBI didn't like Kennedy because Hoover was approaching retirement age, and it was very clear that Kennedy was not going to reappoint him, whereas Johnson ultimately waived the retirement age and kept him on the job. So all of these actors somehow were involved in this assassination with multiple shooters. Then Robert Caro finished this last biography of Johnson, last book in it, and makes very clear that Kennedy was planning to drop Johnson from the ticket. Johnson was mired in a scandal with Billy Saul Estes, an oil guy in Texas, and another scandal with Bobby Baker, Secretary to the Senate, who was sort of his protege, and some say his bagman. And we know that Life magazine was planning to run a full cover picture of Johnson, wondering whether or not he was going to be indicted, and that the Justice Department under Bobby Kennedy, who hated Johnson, was moving aggressively to go after him. And we know that John Kennedy told his assistant, secretary, confidant, Evelyn Lincoln, that he was planning to drop Johnson and probably replace him with Governor Terry Sanford of North Carolina. That process stopped dead the minute Kennedy was killed, and the fact that he was, of course, killed in Texas, which was Johnson's turf, has given rise to speculation that Johnson may have been behind the assassination. Now, we don't know, and there's no smoking gun, there's no direct evidence of it. There are some statements Johnson made to a mistress, but it's not clear. But in any case, this scandal has developed over the years to a point where it's quite clear that it was not Lee Harvey Oswald acting alone. It might not have been Lee Harvey Oswald at all. And it was some combination of the mob, the CIA, the FBI. This casts it in an entirely different light. It was no longer an assassination, it was a coup d'etat. It was a coup d'etat to replace Kennedy and put in Johnson. Now, whether it was done at the instance of Johnson or not, it's not clear. But Hoover needed Johnson to be in there. The CIA had Johnson as a loyal friend, and the mob knew that Johnson wouldn't touch them, and he didn't. He was laid off them for his entire term, and everybody did until Reagan finally took them out during his administration. So, in understanding the assassination, we have to understand it for what it was: a right-wing coup against Kennedy. The broader context, which we'll discuss tomorrow in the history video, is that Kennedy was moving toward winding down the Cold War and was moving toward treaties with the Soviet Union. He already signed a nuclear test ban treaty with Russia. That was the first agreement between the countries since the end of World War II. And a lot of the Cold War hawks and military-industrial complex types were very, very upset by that. And that might well have been the object of the coup, which was probably what happened on November 22nd, 1963. Thanks for watching.